Hi, welcome to week 10 of Living Sent. This particular session is on the call to vocational ministry. As we conclude this concept of the missionary task, we've been thinking through how God uses ordinary people to do His work, His extraordinary work. But in particular, as we think through this idea of vocational ministry, we recognize that really throughout the entire missionary task, but especially as we think through the leadership development and exit, we recognize that God occasionally will call very specific people, again, ordinary people, to do His work of vocational ministry. He will call pastors, He will call missionaries, He sometimes will call para-church leaders, but ultimately, this is His work that He's asking us to join, and He'll call individuals to join Him at a more particular, more defined, a special level, if you will, of ministry. Not that there's any super Christians, and there's definitely not any professional Christians, but there are times where God will set aside different leaders for this vocational ministry. There's two lanes of thought as we approach this subject. One, we should address this from the idea of the calling of an individual, but we also need to think through how do we as a church prepare for the calling of individuals. How do we support that calling? How do we as a church organize around the opportunity to call out vocational leaders? We see that throughout the Bible, both Old and New Testament, that God has called out individuals to do particular tasks. We see that both described and prescribed. In particular, we see scriptures like 1 Timothy 1 1 Timothy 3 verses 1 through 7. We also see it in Titus 1, a number of other places. We see that God is not only calls out individuals, but He gives a specific qualification for them as well. Now, we have to recognize that as disciples of Christ, we are always to be making other disciples. We need to be disciples who make disciples. And yet there is a special level, a special nature to the mentoring and the development of those who would be involved in vocational ministry. So we think through this from this individual perspective. We think through this from the church perspective, and we recognize that vocational ministers will ultimately serve in and through the church, but this is obviously for the glory of God. This missionary task, as we began with entry of intentional missional entry, we think through evangelism, we think through discipleship, we think through church formation, we think through leadership development, and now into exit. But again, we are to join Him in the work. All of this is His work. It's all about His glory and His systems, His processes, if you will, to bring about those who will come to glorify Him and praise Him. We are to join Him in His work. As we think through how any given individual might be called to vocational ministry, Charles Spurgeon gave us some very helpful factors, very helpful ideas to help us think through how do we know whether we're being called into vocational ministry. The first he gave us was overwhelming desire. And Paul references this in 1 Timothy 3. Bottom line, do we have a desire? Is it truly our overwhelming burden, if you will, that God has given us to be vocational ministers? This is almost like a nagging. It's as though that you have an internal desire that God simply will not let you go. It's been wisely said that if you can do anything else, do it. And the idea behind that concept is if you are called to vocational ministry, God's not going to let you go. He's going to nag you. He's going to burden you. He's going to call you until you submit to that calling. So if you have the ability, if you will, not human ability, but if you are able to if you're able to do something besides vocational ministry, it's very possible that you're not being called. Secondly, do you have the ministry gifts? In other words, has God spiritually gifted you to carry out this work? This is not the same as natural human abilities, not the same as human talents, but has God supernaturally gifted you to carry out this desire, this work of vocational ministry? Thirdly is God's blessing. Where you have served in the past, is God blessing that work? Have you seen spiritual fruit as a result of the work that God has done in and through you? Is that something that goes beyond what you could have done yourself? And then fourthly, is there an affirmation of others? For those around you that you would consider spiritually mature, are they affirming your work as God's work? Are they seeing something in you that goes beyond what you personally are able to do? It's possible that affirmation of others is an affirmation of God's call to you in vocational ministry. So that we see that from an individual perspective, but we also need to think about this from a church perspective. What do we need to do as a congregation, as a body of believers, to help mentor and bring up others who are called to vocational ministry? Again, this goes beyond the regular, the routine making of disciples. That in and of itself is God's work, but we are to engage in it. But this takes a special level, and that special opportunity is to help those who are feeling called to have the opportunity to serve in a manner that might verify or, in fact, tell them that they're not called to vocational ministry. In other words, we should give them opportunities to serve in special ways, such as teaching or particular service opportunities, or even the opportunity to preach, to see how the Lord is leading, and to see if that is indeed God's work. At the end of the day, we need to recognize that we as a church need to build systems and need to build opportunities for people who are called to vocational ministry to test that calling for themselves. I would ask you a couple of questions. Do we as a church have that system in place? Do we have the opportunities for people to serve and to test their calling and to find out really whether God is calling them into vocational ministry or not? I'd also ask you as an individual, is God calling you to vocational ministry? How does your life compare to those factors, those indicators that Spurgeon mentioned? At the end of the day, we recognize that spiritual leadership is necessary to build other spiritual leaders. We need to have those systems in place. We need to be looking for those, and we need to be mentoring those who may be called out such that God can bring about this next generation of leaders to conduct the missionary task in and for His glory.